Hey everybody, this is Carlos Ocelot, founder and CEO of G2 Esports, former professional gamer, and wonderful bodybuilder, as you may have known. Of course, you know me for that, pretty sure. And you're watching Dankan's channel. Thorin, my man. Enjoy.
League of Legends has two big, meaningful international tournaments each year. They have the World Championship, obviously the most important. The name's pretty self-explanatory. And they have the Mid-Season Invitational, which is clearly the second most important. And in fact, the difference between the two tournaments is very well defined. Obviously, MSI is where it's just a champion versus champion format. That's the gimmick. You win your region. You potentially get to qualify depending on whether you're from a major region or a wildcard region. Whereas at World Championship, obviously, is X number of slots from that region. And as we saw in at this Worlds with IG, where they won it despite being the number 2 seed out of China. And obviously in the past, we've had Samsung White win it as the number 2 seed, and we've had SK Telecom win it not as the number 1 seed. So obviously it's a different format. In fact, I actually think that's quite a cool distinction, that they had two very important tournaments, but there's a reason why they're different. They're not just two world championships. Even though, to some degree, as someone coming from a game like CSGO, I wouldn't mind if you had two world championships. Like in CSGO, we have two majors, and they're just basically both a world championship but held twice a year. So obviously Rift Rivals, where it's kind of like Worlds, but no one really cares as much. All-Stars is explicitly, it's a fun exhibition tournament. These are basically held for fun. Teams don't put the same status upon these. No one really cares about the results as much. Obviously, IEMs, Intel Extreme Masters, held by ESL, were held for many years, but aren't held anymore. And if you go into certain regions, you still have other cups, like they have the Demacia Cup and Nest, etc. in China, but they don't have the international competition generally. They have the occasional tournament like the Asian Games where China and Korea compete, etc. But this isn't the same as a big international League of Legends event. Now, in this world of the two big international events, as an outsider, someone coming from games like Quake and Counter-Strike and Dota, StarCraft, League of Legends always felt unsatisfying to me, primarily due to the lack of repeat matchups. Now, Riot's angle on that, I get it. It's a different one from me. It's not one I agree with, but it is coherent to some degree, which is and this is what they often argued in Season 3 and Season 4, they want the circuit, and this is back when there was only Worlds, they want it to be that you don't play those teams over and over again. They built up the angle that, it's like MMA, the UFC, or a big boxing bout. You want those two teams not to have faced each other. And then in boxing, you want them to beat a whole bunch of cans and then contenders. And then finally, you want those two people to come together. You want Pacquiao and Mayweather hopefully to come together at their prime. It didn't happen in boxing, obviously, but that's when you'd hope that they meet. And that way you make the super fight that you get all the money in for. Well, I can tell you, first of all, like I just alluded to at the end, the real reason for that is actually just because those are pay-per-view sports. They specifically want to get all the hype onto one match, and because no one's watched it, no one can really have any sense of who definitely is going to win or what it would even look like. They can imagine the best possible version of it. They've got the insane record, and they want to get all the money off you there. And if it ends up there's not that great a fight, they don't have to worry about Fight 2 and Fight 3. They can do that if they want to, but they got all the money up front immediately. What if they had the fight and it was rubbish? Would anyone pay for Fight 2? See, it's a different business is my point here. And the model fits that business and has had certainly some success in the past. You could argue it's not having as much success now. And so for League of Legends or these sports games, I don't really know that's actually is appropriate, really. So then you look, obviously, Riot loves the fucking NFL with the different conferences and the playoffs being one and done. Also, there's a lot of hype when people meet in the Super Bowl. They might not have played in that season, etc. Again, different sport. The best of one aspect there, the limited number of games, is mainly because of injury factors in that particular sport. And the fact that you already have a massive roster of players. So even more than just the physical aspect, meaning you can get injured, a couple of key players getting injured can ruin your entire chances to win the Super Bowl, as the fucking Broncos know from that one back in 2013, 2014 when they played against the Seahawks, but they had their best defensive player injured, whole bunch of factors like that. So when you come down to it, for my money, as someone who's watched a lot of other esports games with formats in which you get repeat matchups of the best teams in the world over and over again, sometimes every few weeks or a month, but sometimes every couple of months, from watching those games, matchups become more interesting the more times the really good teams and the really great matchups occur. It's actually only when you're a couple of matchups in, you feel like you've hit the meat of that particular rivalry, that particular A versus B, and you have a sense for like your grounding of what it was like last time, what you can expect in the future, what one team might have to change to win based on what happened last time, what the other team would have to do even better now that the opponent's seen it. That's where you get to the really, really crazy matchups, the really great matchups. And so until you get there, I always find those first matchups, they have a gimmick to them, they have a novelty to them, but I also think that's why there are way more erratic results when teams haven't met before. I mean, let's look at some of the reasons. Like, first of all, yes, you scrim against some of those teams when you're at a tournament, like MSI, like Worlds. Now, putting aside the fact that sometimes, like Worlds, the top Korean or Chinese teams might actually only give you a scrim or two. And if you play like shit and you're a Western team, they say, actually, fuck that. We're too busy to practice against you. So aside from the fact already in scrims, you're not just practicing and practicing for purpose. You're sometimes having to play like almost like a trial game to get into the proper practices against top teams and prove your worth. Putting that aside, scrims can never replicate the stage environment of being on stage with the cameras, the lights, your jersey, like a limited amount of time. You can't just walk off to the toilet, you can't ask for a pause as teams sometimes did in NA when LCS teams practice so that fucking Zix could coach CLG on what to do on the next macro rotation. This is different from a stage environment. You also can't replicate the pressure of knowing this is the real game. The decision making you would make under all of that pressure and in a one and done scenario, as opposed to a scrim where go next if it goes badly or whatever, we'll get it back later. The first time teams meet, there are so many factors at play that might not have that much overall to do with the outcome in terms of who's the better team. Like you have the clash of styles. So Team Liquid came from the LCS and their style objectively ended up being the best overall. They won the most games in the regular split and they won the playoffs. And actually, let me think of all the teams who in the playoffs who made it deep, they lost the least games actually. Yeah. So their style actually won out in NA, but they go internationally and immediately it's not just that the opponents are better, the style doesn't match up anymore. It doesn't work as well. Likewise, the strengths that players have, you don't really know the strength of a player until you face him in the server. This is something top pros pretty much always all agree upon, is that you can watch a demo and he might look amazing or he might look crap, but until you're in there, and the term they always use is like you feel the resistance back from it. You try to do a move, you feel some pushback. You make a small action, he punishes you, or he fails to be able to punish you, or he can't stop you. These are the sorts of things you can only gauge when you're actually in there with the guy. And then there's the whole regional differences, how teams practice and play elsewhere in other regions, when they peak in the tournament, what they're like at the beginning. These are all factors that are going to be very alien, really difficult to gauge first time you meet them. Then you look at League of Legends specific factors, like at the tournament, the international tournament, you're spending the first week sometimes battling the game and the developers as much as the other teams and the rest of the field, because you're adapting to the current patch and the current meta, which may be not just different, but sometimes radically different from what you played on in the split to qualify you to this international tournament. So you might have to not only change what you're doing, but then when you're studying your opponent, you can look for tendencies and concepts behind how people made decisions. But if this meta and patch changes radically, to some degree, you have to sort of toss out a lot of that research and data and sample size you had of that team playing in their region against the other top teams or a team vaguely similar to you if you want to shadow box the result. It ain't the same as just being able to look, like if you're a Counter-Strike team coming to a Counter-Strike tournament now, okay, let's look at the tournaments they played over the last month and a half. Let's get a sense of how they're playing. Different game, different opponents, so much more difficult to get a sense in that sense. Then, how about the fact that because of the different patch, within each tournament, as the tournament develops, this is something I noticed that was unique to games like Dota, like League of Legends, the MOBA/arts games, is you develop an intra-tournament meta of the champions and how the game is played that is always slightly different from how it was back in your own regions, back with previous patches, back with different players collectively, all competing against each other in scrims and official games. That as a result of all these factors, league-specific ones and factors of you just meeting them for the first time, there is a way bigger chance of an upset from my experience when teams are first meeting, or they're first meeting with this exact lineup, or they're first meeting on this specific patch. Way bigger chance of upsets. There's the surprise factor. You might not know the team very well. Because they're a lesser team like PvB, for example, Fengvu Buffalo, maybe you didn't put as much time into researching them as you did the other opponents. There's the lack of context for their region. Like, yes, you saw this team lose against Team A in their region, but you don't know how good Team A is, and you don't really know what the resistance will be like playing Team A. You've maybe never played Team A. So it's hard to actually gauge much from that. In the Counter-Strike example I gave, even if it's a team I've never played before, maybe they played, I'll give you a CS team here, they played against North in a smaller tournament, and I've played against North a lot, and I know which maps North is good on and North strengths, so by proxy, yeah, it's not flawless, but I at least have some kind of a Rosetta Stone to start translating what the strengths of this team might be and where I can get edges and where they have edges. Then there's the factor that you get to the event, you try to scrim them to get some knowledge about them then, and those don't really tell the whole story, as I alluded to before. I mean, another aspect of scrims that also doesn't make them work is some lesser teams and players are so thrilled to be in a scrim with this amazing international team that they're playing the scrim to win. They're doing it. They're cheesing fucking scrims. They're playing scrims like super tryhards. They're not just practicing, where sometimes, famously, some of the Chinese teams used to do this back in the day. They would just be playing the scrim just to test something out. And they didn't give a fuck if you beat them and you were bragging, we beat this team 7 times in scrims. Koreans supposedly did this to Chinese sometimes. Like, they were just messing around, testing something out. So you then go in the tournament thinking you're super strong. You don't know they were just toying with you or just testing something that actually maybe you even showed them didn't work and they throw that out entirely. When you get repeat matchups, there is so much that can come from this. First of all, you know your enemy. He might know you. That's an interesting dynamic at play, right? Surely, with top players and top coaches, you're rewarding people who can benefit from that experience, who can adapt from last time you play them. You're making it way more of a gimmick if the teams and players have never played each other. They're just meeting now, or just meeting now with this lineup, or I played you last event when I was IG and you were G2. Oh, they've got most of the same players, but they don't really, do they? Because now their mid's are AD carry, and now their bot lane's completely different. So we think we know that team, but really how much of that applies from what we know in the past, right? Whereas actually, G2 in this sense, sure, in terms of the way IG plays, they play a little bit different, a little bit. But actually, G2 has the information advantage coming into that matchup. They've played against that exact IG. Well, some of them have. And so they have some sense of how they might play in a way that actually IG can't have about G2. Then also, you get the whole game within a game. What do you choose to adjust and what do you keep the same? What do you say, that worked last time, but actually I can execute that even if they know it and make it work anyway? You come into now a different set of criteria as to what makes you win a game, because a whole bunch of cheese probably isn't going to be that great that often if you're a top team in this scenario. Maybe it is if you're a lesser team, you want the upset. But if you're a top team, sometimes you just want to execute what you did last time that worked, and in doing so, show that you're the better team, right? That they couldn't adapt to you, that it is a true strength of yours. You now get to show that you really know yourself and your opponent. I've given this example in the past, but one of the factors of meeting again and again, well, in a game like Dota 2, which oftentimes, especially in the heyday of like 2013 to 2015, largely featured double elimination tournaments. Obviously, the interesting thing there was, in Dota, teams could sometimes meet in the same tournament 3 times in Best of X series. They could sometimes meet in the group stage, in the upper bracket, and in the lower bracket or the final because they had double elimination. Well, an interesting detail is one of the best Western Dota teams of all time is Evil Geniuses. In Season 5, not Season 5, in the International 5, I got caught up in League of Legends talk there. In the International 5 in 2015, they actually were able to win the International, the biggest tournament. They won a couple of big tournaments. Well, the thing is, this core under PPD and different phases of time with Sumail and Arteezy, Universe and Faye, etc., this core was able to win many championships over the years where PPD was their in-game leader. And the majority of them they won. Off the top of my head, I think the number they'd won was like 8 championships during this time period. And something like 6 of the 8 they won from the lower bracket. And of those 6 of the 8, something like 3 or 4 times they'd already lost to the team they then beat the second time around in the final of the lower bracket, en route to winning the championship. So you saw actually they got stronger the more matchups they had against someone, because their strength must have been adapting, figuring out their strengths, figuring out what their own limitations were. Whereas the other opponent, in a format where you only meet once, would have won the tournament or would have beaten this team and eliminated them. So you see what a different world you can be in depending on the format, depending on how often you meet teams, how often you play teams. It really does change the matchup. It's not the same matchup every time, uniformly just reset and started over, is it? Then you look at the fact that in a game like CSGO, some of the best matchups between teams sometimes come like 4th or 5th times the exact same lineups and meet each other in a 6-7 month span. I mean, everyone who's a North American CSGO fan knows how incredibly exciting it was when Cloud9 won the major, E-League Boston major, and in doing so, beat FaZe Clan in the final. Not only was FaZe the #1 team on paper in the world and were favourite to win not only that tournament but the final, but when Cloud9 played them in the final, that exact Cloud9 lineup had played that exact FaZe Clan lineup in 3 best-of-3 series in the months leading up to the major, and every time they got swept 2-0 by FaZe, they got smashed, they never won a map against them, as I alluded to, and in fact most of those maps, I think only one of them, they got over 10 rounds, and you need 16 rounds typically to win a Counter-Strike map. So incredibly dominant by FaZe. Someone who thinks that like repeated matchups are boring would say, don't play that out of 4th time. We've already seen it. Where's the hype? Where's the Riot UFC, NFL, Super Bowl style hype? Like, why am I excited about that? Well, you're excited about it because the actual matchup allowed something completely different to happen because they'd played so many times, and now they were playing in the major final. Before they were playing in a semi-final or a smaller tournament. Now they're playing in a major final. Another factor comes into play, and you know what? It was actually the FaZe Clan guys who choked under pressure and who gave up a lot of bad rounds. The guys from Cloud9 actually played above and beyond their normal level and played some inspired Counter-Strike. Elsewhere, you think of some of the great rivalries in CSGO. One of my favourites, if you go back to 2016, coming in 2017, was Virtus.pro against SK Gaming. The best Polish team against the best Brazilian team at the time, the #1 team in the world. These guys had a whole bunch of great matchups. At the majors, there was always 3 maps. But some of the best matchups they had were in the latter part of 2016, when, as I said, they were playing the 3rd, 4th, 5th series against each other, and those matches were just getting better and better and better and better. These matches were getting really crazy because these teams knew each other. It was a dance within a dance. So when you play a team multiple times, you also get the chance to showcase that you are dominant. You are much better than them. You can repeatedly beat them. Doesn't matter what they change. You can beat them when they know you, when they know your strengths. You can beat them when they've had a chance to beat you before. As a result, you have a chance to set the record straight. You can get revenge. You can show who's better. Did you lose this one? Well, you can play them in a month or 2, right? One of the problems I have with the current format is not only do players not get that much experience, but even more so, the pressure and the premium place to put a good international experience is bonkers in League of Legends. Now, in one sense, that could be cool, you know, who's going to make it, who can handle the pressure. But I also feel like after seeing so many players in those other games have like a bad first 6 months or first year and then become very adept LAN players, you've also got to give people enough time to get blooded to the scene and actually get their feet underneath themselves and get some experience before you can judge them. Whereas I think people get judged too quickly in League of Legends, actually. I mean, in a game like CS, you get like 3 or 4 LAN tournaments before someone's going to kick you out of the team. In LCS, you might get 1 split, you might get 1 international tournament, and then you're labelled. You're a choker, a loser, you weren't good enough, you can't perform well. Like, that might happen in CS, but you're going to get a lot more cracks in it before they really label you and it's going to hinder your career because you've been stigmatised. International experience generally is obviously much more limited in a game like League of Legends. Sure, it's more of a global game with much, much more developed regions, I'll say that. But you look, there are people who are years into the game who haven't really got that many tournaments under the belt themselves, like Doublelift, who just made playoffs of his first big international tournament in the LCS era, at least in terms of MSI and Worlds. Yeah, he's obviously been to IEMs, etc. He's only been in 7 of those scenarios. Now, that's a lot. That's actually a lot for a Western League of Legends player. 7, that's not that crazy for people who've played majors in CSGO, people who've played 7 international. Well, actually, I can't be possible. Yeah, it could be. I think it's been 8. You know, this is like, actually, how many chances did he really get before he'd been labelled a choker in that sense? Then you've got to look at the fact, and this is just a fact, think back through history. Think about teams who play better domestically than they do internationally. Now, people in the league context will go that they're just not as good teams. No, it's a different environment. That's the point. Or maybe they get better after they've played someone a few times, or they know the style, they know the region, they know what it's like to gauge strength from looking at other teams they've played against. Think about it. you have the stylistic angle, which means that you might be better against this one team domestically, but internationally you'd be worse. You might have a good matchup against this team domestically, but internationally you wouldn't get that matchup. You might have weaker players, but because they know the players they're playing against domestically, you can beat them there, but you wouldn't beat them internationally. I'll give you 2 examples that go either way. So an example of teams that were clearly strong in one matchup, but not as strong against everyone. Well, how about this? I think it'd be season 6, maybe, Afrika Freaks. Season 7, the ones where, this is before they got Kuro and all those guys, but the ones where famously they were SKT's kryptonite. They weren't that great a team in the LCK. It's way before they were a team that could make the finals, but they could beat SKT when SKT was the best. Season 5 to Season 8, Flash Wolves getting all those upsets over Korean teams, particularly over SKT. They were way better against SKT, both these teams, than against anyone of comparable level to SK Telecom. Like EDG, RNG, these teams at times were worse than SKT, but they were still able to completely smash the Flash Wolves, take care of the Flash Wolves easily. So imagine that the Afrika team had been from another country. There was some wildcard team and they were beating SKT. People would be bigging them up. Oh, they're so good internationally. But if you saw them domestically, they're nothing like that. Then you go the other way, the Samsung Galaxy /KSV/Gen G core, which is obviously the same 5 players collectively over 3 different years. They were way better at Worlds than they were in the LCK. Their best ever split finish in the LCK with that lineup was in the regular portion of the LCK. They once finished second. It was in spring of season 7. Other than that, they never ever finished top 2 except that one time. And in the actual playoff portion, they were famously oftentimes worse than they actually were elsewhere, despite the fact they would win the Gauntlet all 3 years. And the Gauntlet is a kind of a playoff. It's the same exact format as the Gauntlet playoff of the playoffs. But in the playoffs, their best ever result with that lineup, 3rd place in the same split. Season 7 spring. Otherwise, they weren't even making top 3. And yet this is a team that when they went to those 3 World Championships, they twice made the finals, back to back. They were 1 game from winning Worlds in Season 6, a season they never made a single LCK final, never made top 2 in the regular split. Season 7, they won Worlds, despite never making an LCK final, only once being top 2. Season 8, they were even worse, and they managed to actually go and bomb out of the groups. Where's the rhyme or reason there? Imagine how differently you'd think of that team if they'd only had the Season 8 results. Now imagine how differently you'd think of them if they'd only had the Season 7 results. Completely different. Night and day, the judgments you'd make on them. You have to have playing strengths that look domestically and internationally. Those are different factors. Then there's the fact that the format in league tournaments like this is you play a bunch of best of ones and it's round robin. Now, round robin in some senses makes it easier to get out of groups because you can fluke your way out. But that's also why, if you're a top team, it actually can make it trickier to get out of the group. There are way too many banana peels to slip on because you play the top teams, you beat them. If you let up a little bit and you give up the wrong best of one, suddenly there's weird tiebreaker scenarios. Also, anyone who knows about round robin knows there are clear flaws I always point out in CSGO. Like, for example, you can have a game at the end of the round robin that means nothing to the team that you need to win. That's an underdog team. They're out of the tournament already. But it means something to you because you need the underdog team to upset your rival for a playoff spot, and they don't give a fuck, they don't try properly, and they lose that game. But when you played that underdog team, and maybe they beat you or upset you, or you beat them, maybe you played them at the beginning of the tournament when they had everything to play for, and therefore the games are not uniform in terms of their actual value and importance and significance to the tournament, yet they're treated by the format as though they're uniform and of identical, equal value, but they're not. That's the inherent flaw and almost paradox of playing in round robin. Oh, it's fair, you get to play everyone once. Yeah, but the order you play them in matters quite a lot, actually. That's a factor to be thought about. So if you look at Riot's approach, I get it as to why these problems occur, and they likely always will, because Riot generally wants it, because you don't meet very often internationally, that you do play everyone. So hey, Flash Wolves gets to play all the other major regions. So if you're a fan from LMS, you get to know what it'd be like to see the matchup. That's cool in its own way. I can give a nod to that. There's also the fact that due to the divide, there's mass appeal when you've divided everyone up into separate regions for fans to want to see those teams all play each other, not just play 2 games and go out, or someone play 2 games and win a GSL group. Okay, I get that. I don't like it as much as a purist, but I get some of that. This video is more food for thought because when these teams go internationally, people are drawing way too strong conclusions off those matches. In fact, because it's a more important level of play, they act as though international play tells us more about those teams than the 15, 20, 30 games they might have played domestically and against competition they know. It's the opposite. The domestic play tells you more about them as a team. The international play tells you what happens when they face a team for the first time, when they're in an environment potentially for the first or second or maybe third time, when they're in a bunch of different circumstances with all these different extra variables of having to adapt and practice for someone and then take things from scrims and play an official game and play on stage with different pressure. That's actually a whole set of different criteria than when you're playing domestically. And it says more actually about maybe your character, who you are as a person, than sometimes your ability at the actual game or how good your team is relative to the entire world. Now, I'll point this out at the end because I realise despite making all these points, a lot of people are going to forget this. I'll forget it myself when I see a game. I'll see the first games of MSI and I think, oh my God, fucking LG2's looking so sick. Who can stop them like OllieJ? And then by the end, they don't even finish second in the group. Then they lose to a whole bunch of the bad teams that after day 1 and day 2, you would have said, that's impossible. They can't lose to them. And they did. Now, is Fenglu Buffalo even on G2's level or as good? No way. Yet Fenglu Buffalo won both times. Is Flash Wolves better than Team Liquid in terms of player strength? Get out of town, of course they're not. But they beat them. It looked fucking good when they did it at times, actually. So that's my point. It's not really something you can draw such strong conclusions of. So as food for thought, I will bring up a phenomena which you might have heard of before that I think applies here. It's called the Gell-Mann, as in with a hyphen, amnesia effect. And a famous example of it is one that's quoted by the author Michael Crichton, the guy who wrote Jurassic Park and Congo and a whole bunch of books. So he says it like this. Briefly stated, the Gell-Mann amnesia effect is as follows. You open the newspaper to an article on some subject you know well. In Murray's case, physics. In mine, show business. You read the article and see the journalist has absolutely no understanding of either the facts or the issues. Often, the article is so wrong, it actually presents the story backwards, reversing cause and effect. I call these the wet streets cause rain stories. Paper's full of them. In any case, you read with exasperation or amusement at the multiple errors in a story and then turn the page to national or international affairs and read the rest of the newspaper and read as if the rest of the newspaper was somehow more accurate about Palestine than the baloney you just read. You turn the page and you forget what you know. So even with all of this in mind, even as we all think to ourselves, let's not go too far, the best of ones, it's going to happen. Unfortunately, it's just a phenomenon of how we see the game. What happens when you get limited information, your brain extrapolates out and tries to look for patterns places and tries to take evidence and then say, right, let's only look at this evidence and not use any other factors at play, basic analytical tools, etc. So I don't blame anyone. I'm going to fall into it myself. That's why I like the formats to just be fixed. I don't even have to consider this. But food for thought when you look at these international competitions. This video was kindly supported by Wendelful, Butt Pounder 420, Dean Tanglis, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, JDubs, Chi Mao, Daniel Olivar, OllieJ, Tobias Bernasconi, NateDOhDoubleG, Alexander Rao, and a special thanks go out to Jerky's Minion, weixz, don't know how to say that's like a Chinese name, and Max Laine. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for some of my upcoming content? It's going to be a big feature in the next few months for me. Well, my Patreon, that's a feature. Do you want to ask me a question in my monthly AMA? Would you like teasers for my upcoming content? Find out who the next guests are. Maybe you want to take part in that monthly donator discussion with me. Well, if you want any of the above perks, put your money where your mouth is. Support me via the Patreon link below and join the Scrilluminati today.